I still do not have Benjamin. I don't have-
He's on one of the screens. He should be on one of your screens, Aubrey.
I will wave.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, he has the stylish.
It's under Daniel. Now it's under Benjamin. There we go.
Okay, yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. I've seen you speak a number of times as a guest of CIBC, and I have always thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to listen to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
I have been a loyal CIBC client for 40 years now.
Wow, that's impressive. A good choice.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I deal with Ronell all the time, but that's okay. I love him. He's a great guy.
Coke.
Okay. And
Aubrey, I
Yeah.
think we have to admire Julius's shirt. Julius, that is the best shirt. Where are you? Look at that cool guy.
Ryan, is that you in there?
Yeah, I'm just
Oh.
finishing a workout, and but I'm listening in.
That's great. How have you been?
Fabulous. How about you?
Great. Say hi to Jan for me, please.
Absolutely.
Great.
Talk. Thanks.
Okay. Michael, when would you like, do you want to give it another minute or two and then we'll start in?
Okay. Yep. Your call, Aubrey. Sure.
That'd be great. Yurich, Mr. Brown, how are you, sir? Good. You're on mute also. Hi. I owe you a response, which I will get to. Unfortunately, my wife tested positive for COVID this week.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear
A
that.
lot of that stuff, and I've been separating myself from her while I've been trying to avoid getting it myself. So I do have it on my list. I will be back to you, my friend.
No worries. I understand. Take care of yourself and your wife.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Sheila and Alan, or Sheila meanwhile. I don't see Alan yet. How are you, Sheila? Great. And Ruth, we never have a chance to say hello, but hello to Ruth. And Herbert Moon, nice to see you. Great. Okay, Michael, why don't we get it started? It's almost 5 after, and I think that Benjamin probably has a busy schedule himself.
Okay.
Okay. You want to take us away, Aubrey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Herbert, I think that may be you that has your phone, someone in the background.
Hello, yes, it's me. Okay, I just mute my video. Okay, I'm here.
Okay, if we could put everybody on
Okay,
mute.
okay.
Thank you, Herbert. Jahan, nice to see you, my friend. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, special guests, and welcome to the B'nai B'rith Canada monthly Fireside Zoom chat, which will be hosted this evening by Michael Mostyn, the CEO of B'nai B'rith Canada. I'm Dr. Aubrey Zeidenberg, a volunteer with B'nai B'rith for over 30 years, a vice president of B'nai B'rith International, and founder and national chair of the Special Advisory Council to the League for Human Rights since 2004. These monthly events are part of a series done in conjunction with our League for Human Rights, which is comprised of over 35 committed liaisons to the diverse multicultural communities that are now the new collective minority that are the new majority and reflective of the new face of Canada. This advisory council, now in its 20th year, brings together community leaders under the umbrella of B'nai B'rith in an unbreakable friendship as friends of the family that we choose for ourselves. For the last 9 years, I have also been the co-chair with the head of intelligence and organized crime of the York Regional Police Chiefs Community Advisory Council, ISCAC. We are fortunate to have, as members of the B'nai B'rith Advisory Council, numerous senior police officers. Our Integrated Strategic Community Advisory Council deals with organized crime, terrorism, guns and gangs, drugs, vice, human trafficking, and hate crimes. 8 members of our B'nai B'rith Canada Human Rights Advisory Council are also now members of the Police Chiefs Diverse ISCAC project. Impressive past guests that we have had on our monthly Zoom calls have been Jason Kenney, journalist Diane Francis, Richard Heidemann, the world president of B'nai B'rith, CIBC world president and CEO Victor Dodig, Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Federal Conservative Party, York Regional Police Chief Jim McSween, former Toronto Police Chief Jim Raymer, Tom Carrick, the Commissioner of the OPP, John Tory, Rocco Rossi of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, former Premier of Ontario Ernie Eves, Majid Al-Shafi, who heads up One Free World International, and more recently, the Ontario Solicitor General Michael Kerzner, retired Canadian Senator Jerry Grafstein, and the Israeli Consul General Idit Shamir. This evening, we are going to do a fireside chat format. It will last for 45 minutes in a presentation format. Everyone on Zoom, please place yourselves now on mute, and I will introduce our very special guest for this evening. Benjamin Tell is the Managing Director and Deputy Chief Economist for CIBC Capital Markets, Inc., and he is an exceptionally interesting speaker. Benjamin is a member of the CIBC economic team that is responsible for analyzing macroeconomic developments and their implications for fixed income, equity, foreign exchange, and the commodities markets. He also acts as in an advisory capacity to bank officers on issues related to wealth management, household credit and risk, and corporate credit and risk. Ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin Tell, along with our host for this evening, B'nai B'rith Canada CEO, Michael Mostyn.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Aubrey. Thanks to everyone who's joining us both on Zoom and on YouTube. Welcome, everyone. We are just absolutely thrilled to have you here with us, Benjamin, and just wanted to say a quick shout out and thank you to Ronell Sandler for making that connection for the Special Advisory Council to the League for Human Rights. So welcome, Benjamin.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I think if it's okay with you, maybe we can focus on some larger macroeconomic issues this evening, some of the big issues of the day that everyone's concerned with. If you're comfortable, housing issues, we could talk about inflation, unemployment, fiscal policy, markets, and you're the real expert. I mean, I deal with other things on my day job, but really fascinated to hear what you have to say this evening, as I know we all are, because these are trying times. I don't, I know the markets work in cycles, but certainly there's a lot of concerns by Canadians nowadays about the state of our economy.
Absolutely. That's the right way to put it. And people go to the supermarket, people see prices rising on a daily basis. People are worrying about the housing market. Interest rates are rising to the sky. Inflation is rising, and we are in the middle. So the question is, how do we make sense out of this madness? So I will try to put it in perspective. It's very difficult to predict because nobody knows. We all make it up as we go, But we can try to put it in perspective. And the first question I'm asking myself always, before I start to do anything else when it comes to the economy, is to what extent COVID is an event or a condition? That's the way to look at it. Let's hope and pray that medically speaking, it's an event at the end of the day. But economically speaking, it's definitely a condition. It accelerated so many trends that started. So the economy is very different now than before COVID, and it will be different in the future. So it's a condition from an economic perspective, and we have to understand that condition, how things have changed, and what it means for our daily life. So the number one issue I want to focus on at this point is, of course, inflation. Everybody's talking about inflation. And I will tell you, at the end of the day, this is really not about inflation. This is about the cost of bringing inflation down to 2%. You see, 2% is the target that the Bank of Canada would like to see. It went to 8%. It went back now down to about 3-4%. Not enough. They needed 2%. Now, the Bank of Canada, the Fed in the US, the ECB in Europe, they all have established their reputation as inflation fighters. They're not going to toss it away. They will do whatever it takes to bring that inflation to 2%, even if it means taking this economy into a recession. So you wake up the Bank of Canada in the middle of the night, and you give them two options, a recession versus inflation. They will take a recession any day. And we have to remember one thing, and that's people tend to forget. The Bank of Canada is not an AI machine. The Bank of Canada is not even an institution. The Bank of Canada is human. The Bank of Canada wakes up in the middle of the night worrying about things. The Bank of Canada is puzzled by the situation. They don't have all the answers, so they make mistakes. And it's possible that they're actually making a mistake now, because you see, very important to understand, over the past 30, 40 years, every economic recession was helped, if not caused, by a monetary policy error in which central bankers raised interest rates way too much. Why is that? Because, and that's important to understand, inflation, what you see in the newspapers, inflation is a lagging indicator. Inflation is telling you about the past, not the future. But show me the central banker that will have the guts to stop raising interest rates when inflation is still elevated. And that's exactly where we are. So I believe that the Bank of Canada is overshooting. The Bank of Canada knows that they overshoot, but they prefer to do it. They rather overshoot than undershoot. And that's basically where we are. So they have to make decisions about interest rates, about how high to take them, where to cut it, when to cut interest rates, and by how much. Those are very difficult decisions to make based on where we are now, but they have to do it because it impacts all our lives. Now, I know that many of the listeners now are very disappointed because everybody promised you a recession, yeah? And we didn't get a recession. But I will say, and that's very important, that we are in a recession. I call it a per capita recession. Per capita, economic growth in Canada is down by 3%. Consumption per capita is down by 2%. So that's recession per capita. The only reason why it's not real recession is because of the 1.2 million people that arrived to Canada last year. So we have demand coming from new immigrants, non-permanent residents, we'll talk about them later, that lifts the economy, but per capita, the economy is actually in a recession. And even if you don't do it per capita, we are now growing at about 0%. So it's very close to a recession. So that's something that the Bank of Canada would like to see. That's the reason why they're raising interest rates. And what they will do next, we can discuss later. So that's the background. The economy is slowing down. Inflation is definitely a factor that they have to fight on a regular basis, and they do that.
Well, so you touched on a whole bunch of issues there. The flow of new immigrants coming into this country, but per capita, you just mentioned we're in a recessionary period. Maybe are some of the pundits off when they're talking about immigration into this country? And because often we hear publicly, oh, more immigration is going to drive the economic engine, get things going. Where do we go from here, Benjamin?
That's a very good question. So I had the opportunity to meet with the government in PEI a few weeks ago. And we were talking about housing. And my starting point was the following. I said, if we don't deal in a very effective way with the housing crisis that we have, and we have a housing crisis, affordability crisis, we are going to see rent strike, we are going to see civil unrest, and we are going to see anti-immigrants sentiment. The trajectory is very clear to me. We have to wake up. This is a major emergency. And we can discuss housing in a second when we have time. But I think that's absolutely the way to look at it, as an emergency and a crisis that we have to deal with very quickly. Now, when it comes to new immigrants, we are getting close to 500,000 a year. Some suggest that the number is too high. The point is not really the new immigrants. The point is non-permanent residents, which is more than new immigrants. 65% of people that arrive to Canada are foreign students and foreign workers. And my understanding is that the government is going to do something about it, because if you are a UFT and you bring foreign students, and many of them are coming to Canada, you have to make sure that you can house them. We simply don't have the capacity to bring so many foreign students into this country. And I think that whatever the number is, actually we undercount them. The number is much bigger. So we have a huge number of non-permanent residents, especially foreign students arriving to the country. And the country simply does not have the capacity to house them. So I have a feeling that the government will go after some of those colleges, not the big universities, but some of those colleges that promise a lot of things to foreign students and don't deliver, and they probably will cut that. So I will not be surprised if the number of foreign students next year will be going down significantly. But back to your point about new immigrants is demand and supply. They are demanding houses, but also they supply the labor market. But I think that we don't need to cut the number, but we need to change the point system to make sure that we have enough people in the right occupations. An example, one of the reasons why we have this housing crisis is supply. We simply don't have enough supply. One of the reasons we don't have enough supply is simply we don't have enough labor in construction, especially trades. Now, how many new immigrants are in construction? 2%. It used to be 4%, now it's down to 2%. I say change the point system, bring more new immigrants in construction. Not everybody has to be a computer engineer. And I think that's the direction we may be going. I think that the government is getting it. So immigration is very complex. And I think the focus should be not on new immigrants, but rather on non-permanent residents, especially foreign students. We have to make sure that there is the ability to house them is there.
Yeah, well, you were unpacking a whole bunch of different information there. The point system, I imagine there's been changes to our point system here in Canada. I know folks have been talking about that in other countries and how that's changed over time. But you identified a whole bunch of issues, the foreign students, the no capacity for housing. And I know you were talking a lot about student housing, but certainly we know in the media we have a housing crisis all the way across the board. Is this also part of that answer, or is this a separate issue?
Well, I think that it's connected, because one of the reasons why rent is rising to the sky is because of the fact that many of those foreign students are competing in the rental market. So we have a crisis, and we have to wake up to this crisis, and we have to think big and smart and act very quickly. And I think that a big part of the solution will be a rental solution. You see, in Canada, everybody wants to own a house. It's nice to be able to do it, but that's not reality. I want to create a situation, some of the listeners will not agree with me, and that's fine. I want to create a situation in which you are 35 years old, you are married, you have 2 kids, and you are renting. Nothing is wrong with you. The way it is in Berlin, the way it is in Manhattan, the way it is in London. A rental solution is a big part of the solution. In order to do that, the condo market cannot be the rental market, and the rental market cannot be the condo market. The new wave of new renters will be young families with kids or older people downsizing. They want to deal with a company. They don't want to deal with a landlord. They need stability. Therefore, you need what we call purpose-built rental, apartment buildings, not condos, apartment buildings. And I was calling for the removal of the HST on apartment buildings for a while, and the government finally did it. I think the government will be doing much more to encourage and provide incentives to developers to build not condos, but purpose-built, which I think is the right thing to do. That's part of the solution. It's a very complex issue. We need coordination between all levels of government. And if you are Ottawa and a city, a municipality does not behave well in terms of providing permits quickly enough, you punish them by not giving them money. You can provide them incentives through cash to accelerate the process in which they provide permits, because that's one of the bottlenecks that we have. Again, if we want to discuss the housing market, we have to understand where we are. The housing market now is slowing down, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Why? Because you have to go back to COVID. Prices in COVID, and you all know that, prices in COVID went up by 46% in 2 years, 2020, 21, 46% in 2 years. We've never seen anything like that. Why? That was because of the asymmetrical nature of the crisis. All the jobs that were lost during COVID in the early days were low-paying jobs, young people, renters. That's why actually rent went down. Home buyers, potential home buyers, they were zooming. They were zooming. Their income was there. Interest rates were in the basement. That was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get into the market. There was a sense of urgency to get into the market, and parents told their kids, you do that, we will help you. Gifting reached a record high during COVID, which of course means that the income gap and the wealth gap is widening. Because who can help? People who have. And people who don't have cannot help, and therefore their kids are stuck. You see what's up? So that's something that worries me a lot. So to understand what happened during COVID to the housing market is to say that home buyers got the benefit of a recession vis-a-vis extremely low interest rates without the cost of a recession vis-a-vis a broadly based increase in the unemployment rate. We have never seen anything like that. This means that when you have a sense of urgency to get into the market, you front load activity, you borrow activity from the future. And the future has arrived. We are in the future. This slowdown in the housing market is not a free fall. It's not a crash. It's reallocation of activity over time. You front-loaded activity during COVID, and now you are resting. This is a very healthy situation. I believe that this housing market will remain relatively subdued over the next 6 months. But from a long-term perspective, with all those newcomers, the demand and no supply, we all know where it's going.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few questions just coming out of all of that. I mean, first of all, this parent and child purchasing properties situation that we saw really impacting us during COVID, is that a sustainable situation? Also, with apartment buildings and not condos, which I agree with you. I think that's the way to go. We used to see a lot of apartment buildings built in Canada, and it seems that for some reason we shifted away from that, and perhaps that is an incentive issue, but perhaps you can unpack that a little bit. And I know Airbnb has been spoken about too, and that's short-term rentals as opposed to long-term rentals. And I don't know if you maybe want to go into that, and does that change the calculus a little bit when it comes to housing?
Absolutely, in a big way, and therefore I think that we have to be smart about it. You're absolutely right. The last time we bought purpose-built rental apartment building was in the 70s, and then we stopped. And that's the origin of the crisis that we have now. And we stopped it because of many reasons. I won't get into it. In the 70s, we have to go back to what we did in the 70s and 60s, build more and more purpose-built. Now, because of higher interest rates, because of lack of labor, developers simply cannot make money. So if you give the developer a choice, condo versus purpose-built, they will go with the condo because they make money on the condo. So the government has to provide incentives the way they did in the 60s and 70s, by the way. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. We are basically lobbying the government more and more to provide incentives to developers to build purpose-built. And that's exactly where we are going. So to me, this is very good direction. We have to move fast. We have to run faster to stay in the same place because demand is rising, especially in the rental market. It has to be high quality rental. It has to be affordable. It can be done with the right incentives. So I'm very optimistic about governments at all levels getting it for the first time. For many, many years, we were fighting supply issues using demand tools. For the first time, we realized that supply is the issue. And this pause in activity is actually buying us some time.
Does that impact, because I mean, I've heard from builders too, it's just whether it's apartments or condos. It's too expensive to build. It's just between everything, the whole supply chain of the labor costs and the costs of all of the supplies and products. Is that something part of this? Is your solution, is that workable? Getting beyond that point?
I think so. It is expensive now. It will be cheaper when interest rates are going down, and we'll talk about interest rates in a second because I think that people are interested in that. But I think that an example, the removal of the HST is going to save about $50,000 to $60,000 per unit. That's significant. That's very significant, which means that rent will go down because of that. This is just one move. There are many other moves that they can do that will make the math work. And actually, it's already happening. Some REITs, real estate investment trusts like Dream, just released 10,000 units like that. The minute it happened, they release. All over the country, we are releasing units. So supply is rising. This is just one move. Can you imagine how many more we'll get with a few more moves? And that's in an environment in which interest rates are very high and labor is not really available. So all this means that if we move in the right direction quickly, we can start moving this needle a little bit, because at the end of the day, it's about our kids. Many people have already their house, they are comfortable, but they don't know where their kids will live. And I think that's something that we have to think about. What kind of city we want our kids to live in. And again, rental is part of the solution, but it has to be reasonable rental. Now, of course, a lot has to do with interest rates and where interest rates will be going. So let me spend a few minutes to discuss inflation and therefore the Bank of Canada and its direction when it comes to interest rates, because everybody has a mortgage or GIC, and interest rates are very, very important, and they're very high compared to what we used to. So first of all, inflation. As I told you, it's not about inflation, it's about the cost of bringing inflation down to 2%. But we have some reasons to believe that this inflation is starting to move in the right direction, namely down. First of all, even commodity prices. I know that all of us go to the to the supermarket, and we are overwhelmed by the price of food. But let's remind ourselves that inflation is a rate of change. Inflation is not the price. Inflation is the change in that price. So if food prices go up by 8% last year, and now they're going up by 5%, that's disinflationary because it's rising more slowly. And that's exactly what we see in the commodity market. The commodity market is actually disinflationary. Another factor is supply chain. Supply chain is huge. And supply chain, as we all know, is back to normal. Today in the US, you have 20% more truck drivers than before the pandemic. The measure of supply chain headaches, if you wish, is back to 2019. Now, this has three major implications on prices. First of all, when you don't have supply chain issues, prices are not rising as quickly, and that's exactly what we do, especially for goods. Then another factor is that if all the inflation is coming from supply, from outside, the Bank of Canada does not have the power to deal with it. Believe me, Putin does not care about the fact that the Bank of Canada raises interest rates. Yeah, it doesn't care about that. So the Bank of Canada and the Fed in the US don't have the power to influence inflation because all this inflation is coming from outside. Now with supply chain back to normal, 80% of inflation is domestically driven, which means that the Bank of Canada is more powerful in its ability to deal with the situation. And then there is a third factor. Let's face it. During COVID, many retailers were hiding behind the fog of supply chain. You went to the store, you asked for this dishwasher, and they said, oh, you know, China, supply chain, Russia. But if you add a little bit more, we'll find one for you in the basement. That's exactly what happened. There was very high correlation between supply chain and profit margins among retailers during COVID. Now it's back to normal, which means that you cannot hide anymore. This is a major inflationary force. But let's talk about more forces, which I think you will find interesting. Shelter. We discussed shelter earlier. Shelter inflation. How do we measure it in Canada? So shelter inflation, which is basically housing inflation, is not the price of houses. It's commissions to real estate agents, it's rent, but the most important factor in shelter inflation in Canada is what? Mortgage interest payments that are now rising, by the way, by 30% on a year-over-year basis. Now, think about it for a second. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to fight inflation. Higher interest rates are adding to mortgage interest payments that are adding to inflation. You see? It's like putting a humidifier and a dehumidifier in the same room and let them go at each other. It simply does not make sense. Nobody will be able to convince me that higher mortgage interest payments are inflationary. They are disinflationary. They are disinflationary. What happens when you remove mortgage interest payments from the calculations? Surprise, surprise, inflation is at 2% already. And that's why I think that the Bank of Canada is maybe overshooting, because we're already there if you measure it correctly. But the most important factor is the labor market. At the end of the day, the reason why inflation is sticky is service inflation. And 80% of the cost of services is what? Wages. So you want a narrative about inflation, you need to have a narrative about the labor market. And every first Friday of the month, at 8:30 in the morning, we get the employment numbers from Stats Canada. 8:30 in the morning, first Friday of the month. So at 8:29 in the morning, every economist is sitting in front of his computer, looking, waiting, anticipating the numbers. Believe me, it's very exciting. And every time that we look at that, we look at the number of vacancies. Remember, everybody says we have 1 million vacancies, we cannot find people. And I found that many of those vacancies were actually a mirage. Why? Because in economics 101, they teach us, if you have a shortage of something, the relative price of this something will rise. We had a shortage of low-paid occupations, you know, hotels, restaurants, we know the story. So according to this, their wage, relative wage, should rise faster than any other category that is in less demand. We looked, bottom 20, bottom 40. It went up, but nothing to write home about, clearly nothing to justify 1 million vacancies. So we went to small businesses that employ 80% of those people, and we say, tell me, what's happening here? And they say, well, economists like yourself are telling us that the recession is coming. I'm not going to raise wages 5 minutes before a recession. And I say, you know what? You're not raising wages, you don't need this person. This is not a vacancy. This is a wannabe. It's very easy to press a button and say, I need 5 people. There's no cost. Show me the money. And guess what? Those vacancies are disappearing. They are falling like a stone. I'll give you a few examples how this labor market is now normalizing. One example is very important, is the speed at which people moved from one industry to another. Let me use an example. Let's assume that in a normal recession, not this recession, a normal recession, you were an employee of Air Canada. You lost your job. You went on employment insurance for 6 months. And after 6 months, the recession is over, you went back to Air Canada or any other airline. Today, after 3 long years, you moved on. You're in a totally different industry, totally different occupation. This chart went to the sky during COVID, namely the rate at which people move from one industry to another reached a record high. They simply moved to another industry. So if you were Air Canada, you had to start fresh to hire people. And they started, and they did it. And they were successful. How do I know that? Last week, I was in British Columbia. I took a flight back to Toronto, Air Canada. All the flight attendants were green, were new. How do I know that? They were extremely, extremely nice. So I can tell you that Air Canada has already accomplished that. So the market is normalizing. The relationship between vacancy rates and unemployment rate is back to what it was in 2019. And the quits rate, the rate at which people are quitting, which is a very telling indicator, is now down to 2019. Why? Because the gap in the wage of job quitters, the job stayers, is back to normal. So this is a labor market that is normalizing. That's extremely important to understand. And therefore, I believe that there is no need to continue to raise interest rates. You just need time to allow those high interest rates to impact the economy, because the beauty of interest rates and monetary policy works with a lag. And we are going to see this impact coming. And remember, and that's very important, this economy was protected from higher interest rates by one thing, and that's the consumer. The consumer was sitting, past tense, was sitting on $165 billion of excess savings. $165 billion. Because during COVID, we all know what happens. You got your salary, but you didn't spend anything. So your checking account got larger and larger. $165 billion of excess savings. These savings have been utilized over the past 2 years. So with interest rates rising, you're supposed to slow down, but you didn't because you had this extra savings. This extra savings now is what? Zero. So the buffer is gone. So people are more exposed to higher interest rates, and that will slow down the economy. So in October 25th, the Bank of Canada is going to make another decision about interest rates. And the question is, are they going to raise interest rates or not? It's 50-50. It's 50-50. If you are the governor of the Bank of Canada talking to you this evening, he will tell you, I don't know, because it depends on the data. Whatever it is, I think it's reasonable to assume that we are very, very close to the end of monetary policy tightening, which is good news. The next question, of course, is when are they cutting? That's the question.
Well, that's a big question, for sure. Certainly for those of us who have mortgages still and are working through all of this stuff. I just one little thought, and we might go to just one or two questions in just a moment, because we're going to be looking to wrap this all up very shortly in about 10 minutes. So folks, start thinking of if you do have a macroeconomic question for Benjamin. But is it the same in your opinion with respect to millennial labor workers? Is this something that you've looked into? Because I've heard a lot out there in terms of our younger generation that are coming up into the workforce. And of course, they say younger people are going to have many, many different careers over their life, as opposed to older folks that may be stuck more with one job. Does that have any impact and play in our economy?
To an extent, yes, because they are much more mobile and they are much more active and they are much more choosy and they have attitude. Very different in the older generation. So it's a more dynamic labor force. So people move from one industry to another. That will continue to be the case. But from a macroeconomic perspective, it doesn't make much of a difference. The wage aspect is going to be there. The flexibility of the market is going to be there. And that's important. So from a macroeconomic perspective, I look at the labor market now and I see it normalizing. To me, that's very good because it means that inflation will not be rising due to higher wages anytime soon. So it's just a question of time. Now, the question, of course, what the Bank of Canada will be doing when it comes to cutting interest rates. So let's assume that they are done or almost done. And they're basically going to rest. When are you cutting? I say not before mid-2024. So we still have a while with those high interest rates. Why? Because the Bank of Canada has to make sure that inflation is absolutely dead before they cut interest rates. Now, okay, mid-2024, you start cutting interest rates. By how much? Remember, we started this saga at 175 overnight rate, Bank of Canada. We're at 5, maybe 525, stay there for a while and cut to what? I say about 3. So 1%, 125 higher than before. Why? Because we still have some inflationary forces unfolding. We used to have globalization, now we have deglobalization. That's inflationary. We used to have just-in-time inventory, now we have just-in-case inventory. That's inflationary. We used to have a labor market that was giving. Now it's tight. That's inflationary. And let's face it, many of the green initiatives are inflationary. All those forces are inflationary, and the target is the same, 2%. We can discuss until we are blue in the face to what extent the target should be raised. It's not going to happen. So 2% target, inflationary pressure cooking, by definition, interest rates have to be higher. So let's say 3%. Let me remind you that this economy can do extremely wonderfully at a 3% overnight rate if the trajectory is known and we do the right thing.
Absolutely. So if anybody has a question for Benjamin right now, please feel free to raise your virtual or real hand. Otherwise, Okay, let's go with Uric.
Benjamin, this has been fantastic. I want to thank you. It feels like I'm back in college again.
Thank you.
What a presentation. I have so many questions, but I think the top one is one that comes up among me and my friends quite often. As millennials, we're in a very unique situation. A friend of mine is getting a new house very shortly. Another friend of mine bought a condo a couple of years ago. And the argument we always have is, what happens if we get what we wish for? What happens if the cost of housing in Canada should suddenly come down? How would that affect my friend who's already in versus my friend that's looking to get into the housing market? And how does that affect people who have been in the housing market for a long term versus those who maybe are investing in multiple houses?
Yeah. So first of all, I think we have to distinguish between investors and homeowners, and that people just buy to live in the house. We know that about 50% of condo buyers are investors, and many of them have many investment units, not just one. Now, I think that it's very reasonable to assume that over the next 6 months, prices will go down, or at least they will level off or will go down. I think that's a very reasonable assumption, given the sting of higher interest rates and the fact that the demand is slowing down. There's no question about it. And for the first time, we have more people listing their houses. So that will lead to some softness in prices, which I believe is actually a good thing. Will it bring affordability back? No. In fact, the opposite will be the case. Because what's happening now, developers are not building. You know, in the condo space, you have a pre-sale activity where you pre-sell before you build. They're unable to sell. So they are not building. So 2 years from now, when this crisis is over, when interest rates go down, and they will go down, the demand will be there. We still get all those new immigrants, but the supply will not be there. So from a long-term perspective, I fear that if we don't introduce supply into the system, prices will continue to rise and will make the situation even worse. But I agree that in the short term, there is a risk that the prices will go down. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's going to be healthy. If you are a buyer that bought 6 months ago and the prices will go down, but you just live in this house, forget about it. Just relax and just pay your mortgages because you're not an investor. If you're an investor, you also can relax about it because you're looking at the cash flow as opposed to just value. But investors have to live with this risk because that's why they are investors. But homeowners, I think that don't have to look at day by day what happened to the value of the house because it's really almost meaningless. I think that's the way to look at the situation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we're going to go to Doreen for just a quick question, because I know you emailed us earlier because you had a question for Benjamin.
I did. Thank you. Benjamin, I'm curious to know your take on, is the Bank of Canada's continuing belief that if they control interest rates, they will in fact control inflation and GDP growth? Is it an anachronism at this time?
That's a very good question. At the end of the day, I think they can do that. The question is at what cost? If the Bank of Canada raises interest rates to 7% tomorrow, we will be in a deep recession that will take inflation down guaranteed. The unemployment rate will go to 8.5%. So the question is, how much damage do you want to cause before you reach your cause? That's basically what I'm asking. I believe that they should have stopped 50 basis points ago. I think they are already overshooting. I think that inflation is already on its way down, especially if you measure it correctly without interest payments. I think that the disinflationary forces are acting now more forcefully. I think that the Bank of Canada is more powerful today because the consumer does not have the buffer that I discussed, the $165 billion of excess money. So just wait and see, and you will see that the economy will slow down and inflation will slow down.
Great.
Overshooting is something that they are willing to do because they always can reverse it. So as I said, you give them two options, a recession versus inflation, they will take a recession any day. That's more or less where we are.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for answering that. And I want to be respectful for our guest time. And I know that there's some more questions, but this has just been a fascinating conversation. And thank you so much for participating with us tonight. You actually mentioned your fear for civil unrest and anti-immigrant sentiment if we don't get this right. And I think, and obviously those are big issues for us here at B'nai B'rith. We fight against issues like that every day of the week, and we certainly all don't want to see it. And I think that just shows how important it is for everyone to get these issues right. So that we do have a peaceful society that does continue to grow and is welcoming for everybody. So, so on my behalf, I'm going to turn it over to Aubrey for a close. But thank you so much. This was just a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Benjamin, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule to join us this evening and help us understand a lot of what we, I guess, think about every day, but don't have an opportunity to hear it from somebody who has the pulse of it on a day-to-day basis. So I'd like to thank you very, very much for a very informative and detailed Zoom chat. I'd like to thank all of the attendees this evening for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We look forward to seeing you again in the very near future. And just a little bit of an update of some of the speakers that we have over the next couple of months. November 16th, Phyllis Heidemann. Phyllis is the president of the March of the Living, and she's a presidential appointee to the board of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. On December 14th, we have Pastor Judith James of the Revival Time Tabernacle Ministries. I've known Judith for a long time. I knew her father, Pastor James, many, many years ago, and you would find what they have to say and their overview extremely, extremely exciting. There will not be a speaker in January, but as we move into February, we'll have Order of Ontario recipient Jeannie Becker, her life and times and her recent battle and survival of cancer. And then we will have Dr. Kieran Murphy, a world-renowned neuroradiologist specializing in spine and brain with medical interventions that he has invented that are used now over 80,000 times annually around the world. We're fortunate to have him here in Toronto at Toronto Western Hospital. He comes from Johns Hopkins, and he will be an absolutely exciting speaker. And I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us this evening. Please look for the future invitations that will be coming out. I thank you again to Benjamin Tull, and we'll see you in the months up in front of us, upcoming. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody. Thank you, Michael.
Good night. Good night.
Good
Thanks,
night, everyone.
Night.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Good night.